So, welcome everyone to our event today, rereading a heroic legacy, how AIDS built the LGBT equality movement, which we're holding as part of Open Access Week. Open Access Week aims to inspire and encourage further dissemination of knowledge through free access, and I'm delighted to see you all here today at our event. I'm Rachel Katarski, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Associate University Librarian for Digital Strategy and Services, based out of the Regenstein Library here at the University of Chicago. Our author today approached my colleague Adrian, who arranged today's event at some point earlier in this year, earlier in 2024, seeking to make his book, recently out of print with the University of Chicago Press, freely available online. And we absolutely jumped at this chance not only to facilitate that and enable free and wider access to this great book, but also to showcase the work during Open Access Week through this event. So we're delighted to be hosting and to welcome our two guests. The first of whom is our author, John Manuel Andriott. John Manuel Andriott is an author, journalist, and speaker. He has focused on health, LGBTQ issues, and popular culture for more than 3 decades. As one of America's leading writers on the HIV/AIDS pandemic, Andriott began to focus his reporting on this topic while working on a master's degree in journalism at Northwestern University in 1986. His articles have appeared in newspapers and magazines ranging from The Atlantic to The Washington Post. In 1999, the University of Chicago Press published Andriott's book, Victory Deferred: How AIDS Changed Gay Life in America, the culmination of years of reporting on the pandemic. Hundreds of Andriott's recorded interviews with activists, artists, physicians, political leaders, scientists, and others on the epidemic's front lines, together with his other research materials, are part of the John Manuel Andriott Victory Deferred collection, which is curated by the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. His other books include Stonewall Strong, Gay Men's Heroic Fight for Resilience, Good Health and a Strong Community, Hot Stuff, A Brief History of Disco, and Wilhelmina Goes Wandering, an illustrated children's book based on the true story of a runaway cow in Andriott's home state of Connecticut. I'm also honoured to welcome our interlocutor for today, Lawrence D. Mass, MD, who is founder of the Gay Men's Health Crisis and was the first to write about AIDS in the press. In 2019, he was awarded GMHC's Founders Activism Award. He is the author of Homosexuality and Sexuality, Dialogues of the Sexual Revolution, Volume 1, and Homosexuality as Behavior and Identity, Dialogues of the Sexual Revolution, Volume 2. He is the author and editor of an anthology, We Must Love One Another or Die, The Life and Legacies of Larry Kramer. He is the author of a memoir, Confessions of a Jewish Wagnerite, Being Gay and Jewish in America, of the sequel to that memoir, On the Future of Wagnerism, Art, Intoxication, Addiction, Codependence, and Recovery, and the forthcoming Wayfaring with Ned Rorem, a non-fiction novella. They form a trilogy Mass has designated as his Jewish Wagnerism series. Mass has written widely on medicine, health, and culture for mainstream and specialist publications. A recently retired physician specializing in addiction medicine, he resides in New York City and in South Florida. And with that, over to you both. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
So,
I
guess I should start. I first of all, I'm very, very grateful to Adrian and the University of Chicago, to our hosts, and you know, I see some familiar faces here, and I'm extremely honored and grateful to be here at all, and I'm especially grateful to my dear, long-term, very esteemed friend and colleague, John Manuel Andriott. John and I go way back to the earliest period of AIDS, and some of my most cherished and you know, vivid memories are things that I've shared with John in that early period. I've just mentioned one of them because I do not want to go off on a lot of anecdotes and tales, but I want this primarily to be John's testimony. But John and I attended in in Arlington, Virginia, we went together to the opening of the museum. It was at that time brand new Museum of Journalism, and it was in Arlington. I think it's moved since that time. But among the opening displays at the museum at that time was my big feature article, which was the first feature article published on AIDS. This followed the first news report that I wrote earlier. And that feature was called Cancer in the Gay Community. And it was a very proud moment, and one that I shared with John. John, well, I'm saying this. I'm much better with reading my prepared notes. So, and again, I don't want to take up too much time with this, but John's work was so important, and his book was so important because in 1987-88, Randy Schultz published his book, and the band played on. It was the first big book on AIDS. It was important as such. It was getting, the subject out there at a very big level, but it was a very skewed book in many ways. It had a lot of problems, which endured and actually worsened over the years. And John's work was really the first balanced, sane, sober history of the unfolding of the AIDS epidemic. As such, it was and has remained a landmark work of gay and AIDS history. It still has a unique and extremely distinguished place among the books that have been written about AIDS. It's the only thing that approaches being, again, a really, fully balanced work on AIDS out there. So without, I don't want to, again, I want to just find a way to turn this over to John now. And I've got some questions. Maybe should I just begin with questions, John? What do you think? Did you have something you want to say up front, or?
Well, I thought I would sort of frame the discussion a little bit as well by talking about where Victory Deferred fit into my work, my career, and how I came to write the book. And I'll be, as brief as possible. But in my bio that Rachel opened with, she mentioned that I had started writing about HIV/AIDS while I was working on a master's degree in journalism at Northwestern in 1985-86. That was when my first two friends died from AIDS. One was 27, one was 30. And I was, as a journalism student, immersed in journalism in those pre-internet years. I subscribed to 5 daily newspapers and I don't know how many magazines. So I was very aware of the growing AIDS pandemic, not just in the US, but globally. I was equally aware of the growing stigma and fear that was emerging in conjunction with the spread of the virus. And that stigma was being targeted toward gay men who were primarily seen as the first victims of AIDS. And from the beginning, and one of the problems in the US in our response to AIDS was from the beginning, AIDS was associated with gay men, and therefore homophobia really shaped the country's response to AIDS, the government's response to AIDS. And so I was very aware of all this. And when my first friends were died, suddenly this global news story became very personal. And it wasn't just my community as a gay man, but it was very close. I mean, these were very intimate friends. And so I thought, how can I respond? It's not enough to just cry and feel sad. I really wanted to contribute something. And what would that be? Well, as it turned out, what that would be was a significant portion of my career as a journalist and focusing on HIV/AIDS and then kind of expanding outward to write about broader health and medical subjects. Um, but I started writing freelancing articles about AIDS, and I worked for a national organization in Washington called the National AIDS Network, which was a coalition of community-based AIDS organizations, one of which, Gay Men's Health Crisis, was one of the founders of the National AIDS Network, of NAN. And um, so through my job as the staff writer at the National AIDS Network, I interviewed, I don't know how many women and men around the country who really were the pioneers creating AIDS service organizations, mobilizing volunteers at the community level, and of course, increasingly lobbying the federal government in Washington. So through my job, through my reporting, I developed a nationwide network of contact sources for my articles. And so in 1994, I decided that I had been writing about this for long enough that, and I knew enough people around the country that it was time to write a book. And so I put together the proposal for the book, and it sort of quickly got interest and a contract, um, and ultimately was published by the University of Chicago in 1999. Um, so that was uh, kind of the history of the book itself. In 2011, I actually decided to update the book, and I did 72 more interviews with folks around the country, and I got a couple foundation grants that allowed me to travel a little bit so that I could do interviews in person out on the West Coast and all over the East Coast. And so I updated and expanded the book, including a new final section of the book that I called The Plague Continues. And partly the reason I called it that is that when I interviewed Larry Kramer for the updated edition, as I had interviewed him for the original edition, Larry Kramer, dared me. And he literally said, "I dare you to use the word plague." And I said, I have no problem using that word because I think it's very apt. So that was kind of the history behind the book itself. Uh, so here we are.
Well, here we are, but I don't think, in all that, really great description, there's this modesty that was always there. But what I remember is what a balm your work was and your attitude. I mean, we were so besieged from within and without. So from without, of course, we were dealing with the country and with the Reagan administration and all this, but from within, we were blasted mercilessly by Larry Kramer and also by um, Randy in his book.
Mhm.
The title of his book says it all. It's just filled with this attitude of, a lot of indictment of the gay community. And uh, you come along and you had this attitude of affirming who we were and what we were achieving and the efforts that we made. You were not trying to tear us down the way, I mean, look, I'm a big admirer of Larry Kramer. He's the greatest, figure of our movement, our time. But I mean, he really, he just attacked us so, incessantly. And it was a tactic. It was who he was and how he was. And the same with Randy. There's a lot of good and important work in that book. But your book had this completely, it's almost seemed revolutionary that you were so committed to a balanced, affirming view of us, of gay people and people with AIDS, with HIV, what turned out to be HIV/AIDS. And I'll just never forget that. And I'm so grateful to you, John. I think we all are.
Well, I really appreciate that, and especially coming from you, one of my great heroes, actually. Um, I think that, and I really appreciate that you articulated that because, my agenda was never to sort of publicly humiliate and shame anyone in our community because for me, and I think this is really important in terms of um, describing why I focused so much of my time and attention on HIV/AIDS, and that is for me as a gay man, writing about other gay men, writing about AIDS afflicting gay men in our community, um, I have always believed that we are fully equal in every way to anyone else, whatever their sexual orientation, whatever their gender identity, race, ethnicity, we're all human beings. And it happens that as a gay man, my experience of being human is kind of filtered through the lens of my experience as a gay man. And so um, it was really important to me to affirm and celebrate what I truly considered the heroism in our community and rising up against, this terrible health crisis uh, and, you know, working against the homophobia that was denying us federal resources that we as Americans, as taxpayers, something Larry Kramer always pointed out, we pay taxes. Why should we have to pay twice to create our own services because of the homophobia in the mainstream, where people, gay men with AIDS wouldn't be taken to the hospital by an ambulance because they were afraid of touching them. There was such ignorance and such fear, and fear based in ignorance. So I just wanted to report on the facts and through that lens of full equality and really affirming the unique value and response of our community to the epidemic.
Yes. I just, again, I'm sort of prone to veering off script here. I have my notes and questions, but now I'm sort of wondering, you've always had this kind of calm and, this sort of, you know, your self-acceptance as gay has been so forefront and important and paramount. What would you say? Could you tell us anything in your background that, I mean, all of us who are LGBTQ plus, have had experiences that shaped us.
Mm.
Was there anything in your own background, family background, that you think was notably contributory to this really heroic figure that you became? Just one last thing. I have the your Zoom picture. I have the Zoom session on my computer, and below it, there's some little space for some advertisements that are kind of coming and going from the internet. And right below your name, as you were just speaking, in big letters, was revolutionary. John, do you think, in your own way, that you are you are what might be called revolutionary?
Hmm. Well, I guess it would depend on uh, the context in which we're describing that. But you asked if there was something in my family history or my background that sort of um, helped me develop the perspective that I brought to this work. And I would say that besides believing that LGBT people are fully equal in every possible way that we could be, except, of course, fully legally equal in too many ways. But, and I've said this in the past, um, I was raised Catholic. My father's Greek Orthodox. I went to an evangelical college where I had an excellent liberal arts education, but I was certainly turned off while I was there to evangelicalism, which I did not fortunately grow up in. But the takeaway from all this and from the work of Charles Williams in particular, who I studied while I was in college, who was a great influence on C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. Um, but Charles Williams, believed and uh, what informed his incredibly vivid imagination was his belief, and I sort of picked this up from him, in the incarnation. The idea that if you believe as a Christian that what we call God became human, then the implications of that for human life are so profound, that our pain, our suffering, our laughter, our joy all matter. And those are very much part of what it means to be human. And so, again, I believe that being human, being in an incarnated being, you know, living in a dangerous physical world, there are dangers, including microbes. But it's humans who decide to attach meaning and significance to one microbe over another. For example, no one judges anyone for having a cold because we all get colds. But, you know, in our culture, if you have a sexually transmitted infection, oh my, we get into all kinds of moralism about your responsibility and it's your fault and there's blame for it. And that was very much magnified, amplified with AIDS, where you have not just a microbe, but a deadly microbe that is transmitted through sex and injection drug use primarily. And these behaviors that um, really rattle a lot of people and, stir up their uh, need to condemn and to feel better than. And I didn't feel that way. I always saw AIDS as it's one of the afflictions, it's one of the horrible prices that we pay as humans for being incarnated. Uh, I don't know how to describe it better than that.
Well, it's beautifully described, and it's also very clarifying because it now I see that what really is there in a lot of your work and underlying work and forming it is a spirituality. And it is not strictly Catholic or
Mhm.
Christian, but it's a depth of connectedness and caring that is, you might well call spiritual. Some of the people you mentioned, the Charles Williams and C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, where you're in very good company and company that fits with who you are and what you've done. And this incarnation concept is something that really informs this wonderful sequel that you wrote to your book. It's not an exact sequel, but Stonewall Strong, which is all about resilience. And resilience is another, term for all of this, what you're describing. Um, and but I know our time is limited, so let me just try to get to a couple of things that we do need to talk about, make sure we include. So this is called an open access event. Why did you choose to make this 25-year-old book open access, and what does that mean for us?
Well, the reason I chose open access after I learned about open access books, because I wasn't familiar really with the concept before. I knew about open access journal articles because I frequently see medical journal articles in my work, that I read a lot of medical journal articles. Um, but part of what motivated me earlier this year was when it struck me that it was 25 years ago, 1999, that the University of Chicago Press originally published Victory Deferred. Um, and it bothered me that every time I would see a list in the LGBT media of the best AIDS books you must read, including a list of 100 books, Victory Deferred is never included in those lists. And I couldn't understand, because being familiar with the literature, I knew that there's no other book quite like it. And that um, not knowing about this book sort of prevents readers from knowing what you and the hundreds of other pioneers and heroes in our community um, said and did in the earliest years of the epidemic. And I feel like, um, without knowing what the book offered, um, it really limited people from benefiting from the lessons that were learned, the insights that were gained. Um, and so I wanted to reintroduce the book in the 21st century, 2024, um, and make it available to people who are interested in learning about AIDS and its parallel, sort of development with the LGBT movement. I mean, historian John D'Amelio said, when I interviewed him for Victory Deferred, he said AIDS built the gay movement. And indeed, I mean, at the beginning of the epidemic, when the first cases were reported in 1981, there was one lobbyist in Washington, D.C., Steve Endine, National Gay Rights Advocates, I believe was the name of the group. One lobbyist, sort of advocating on behalf of how many millions of LGBT people. And the attitude in our community then was we wanted the government out of our business. We wanted the government off our backs. But suddenly we had this massive health crisis that required the resources that only the federal government could offer. And so our activists, our people, had to learn how to do politics, how to do meetings in Washington, how to make a pitch to Congress. Jenny Apuzzo, who was the director of the National Gay Task Force, as it was called at the time, testified before Congress and demanded $100 million for AIDS at a time when the federal government was devoting a pittance to this deadly public health crisis. So it was that kind of audacity, boldness, that was required and that had to be cultivated, learning how to operate within the federal system. Um, So I really wanted people to know this history and know who those people are, whose shoulders they stand on.
Well, you certainly did, you know, seminal, uh, outstanding work in doing that. But on this thing that the way John D'Amelio described it as, the AIDS movement and the LGBT movement, as it was called at that time, were, became enmeshed in terms of their, mutual empowerment and unfolding. That, in some ways it was, I'm thinking back to this thing that I did, which was I felt that, and I advocated in all of my medical advisories for civil rights, gay civil rights to be LGBT civil rights to be an essential consideration in the long range preventive medicine of AIDS. That was science, that was medicine. We needed our civil rights, we needed sanctioning of same-sex relationships, but there were no laws on the books of any kind that would, allow for that, facilitate that. So, you know, uh, without their realizing it, they were having to grapple to an extent that they weren't prepared for, the government, you know, with, these things that they hoped never to have to endorse or deal with. Um, and as we saw with the COVID epidemic, with the current political situation, which is absolutely terrifying, this level of science denialism that we were dealing with them
Mm.
persists, on all fronts. It couldn't be more terrifying. We saw it floridly in COVID, with the later presidency of Donald Trump. So, and that's likely to get much, much worse. So I'm not even sure at this point what I'm asking you from all this, but your bigger topic of the topic that you and John D'Amelio were talking about how the AIDS and LGBT political movements began evolving in tandem. Do you want to say, we got New York City civil rights in '87, and then it wasn't even, still at that time, it wasn't even science fiction that we might get marriage equality. I mean, that was,
Mm.
wow. Do you want to say anything more about that trajectory? Any further thoughts you have about it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that, in saying AIDS built the gay movement, if you think about it, how people, men and women in communities around the country, I mean, New York City, San Francisco, LA, DC, but also Little Rock, Oklahoma City, much smaller towns across the country, neighbors um, came to the aid of their friends, their gay friends. And nowhere was this more visible and influential than San Francisco, which gave us what was called the San Francisco model of integrated, volunteer-based, community-based services, where you had one organization that delivered home cooked meals. You had another organization that would provide AIDS buddies, kind of helping out with practical needs like grocery shopping or things like that. And so as we had people get involved in AIDS, many more people were exposed to, aware of the injustice that gay and lesbian people suffered. And so AIDS brought many allies into the political movement. It brought a lot of money into the movement that didn't exist before, and just a lot of motivation, to finally demand change in the government. So I think that's that's a big part of how AIDS built the gay movement, is by bringing many people who were not politicized before realized that, the political or the personal is political, and nothing is more personal than one's health and life,
The you know, uh, I think that these things inadvertently enter the public discourse. I mean, like there was a trajectory of homosexuality, the word itself entering papal discourse. I mean, it was still, homosexuality was very denounced, but it was actually starting to be mentioned explicitly by, the last few popes. Um, and I think sometimes it's wishful thinking on my part. I think that the same thing is happening with trans issues. I mean, it is a complete nightmare of murders and just a terrible victimization of a small vulnerable minority. And yet I actually have these little flickerings of hope that the fact that the discourse is out there to the extent that it is means that it's going to have to be dealt with more and more legally, even by conservatives and people who, want to pass edicts and do everything else. It's going to get a little tougher and tougher. It's, so in the bigger picture, we seem to need to have to get the stuff out there and have these brawls, these terrible brawls before, progress starts to happen. In the case of the current situation, it may be the end of the world, so there won't be any further developments. But anyway, so this is very, very important. So you now you touched on this business of your book is actually part of a collection. Do you want to say anything more about the John Manuel Andriott Victory Deferred Collection, what that is, and what, how we can access it?
Well, sure. In 2008, I had left Washington, D.C., where I lived for 22 years, and I moved home to Connecticut. And I found myself with 8 boxes of interview transcripts, because I had transcribed myself all of the hundreds of interviews, verbatim transcripts of all of them without a transcription app or machine. So I had all these transcripts. I had correspondence with Doug Mitchell, my editor at the University of Chicago Press, correspondence with others, and probably with you, Larry, as well. And as well as articles that I had been collecting for many years. And so I knew that, and the cassette tapes on which I had recorded all these interviews, and I knew that these things were of historic value. The question was what to do with them, rather than schlepping them around for the rest of my life. And so I started to ask people I know, including John D'Amelio. And through, referrals one to another, I wound up being referred to someone at the Smithsonian, at the Archive Center of the National Museum of American History. And ultimately, the museum board voted unanimously to accept this collection. And so the collection is all of the recordings, all of the transcripts, all of the correspondence, everything that I used in developing Victory Deferred. And it's all now housed there in Washington, D.C. And journalists, scholars, anyone can access those things and use them. And so part of the motivation also in making Victory Deferred open access was that not everyone has the ability to go to Washington, D.C. and spend the time, to research interviews firsthand and so forth. And so the book itself is a pretty good kind of repository of, insights and observations and so forth by the men and women who were there, who lived this history. So that's what the collection is.
Thank you again so much for that clarification, John. It's a very really important collection that I'm sure will be of use to many people and from many different kinds of backgrounds. So for the future. And speaking of the future, maybe we should turn to that now. I mean, we're dealing with a lot of issues on a lot of fronts. I don't want to just say, what do you think about the future? But that's, what are some challenges that we face now without getting too general? And directions that we either are going in, should be going in, or should not be going in. I mean, one of the things you mentioned as part of this is, we've talked about the difficulty in outreach to Black, Latino, and other racial and ethnic minority enclaves and cohorts, if you will, and we know from harm reduction, from our belief in harm reduction, that these are people that we have to, we just have to keep pushing with everything we have to find whatever new mechanisms or approaches of outreach can be more successful than the current ones. But as you pointed out in our discussions, there is recurrent failure. And I know we both agree that we have to do better than that. So that's one aspect of this. But anything else you want to talk about moving to the future? Yeah.
Well, I mean, looking to the future, we have to look at where we are right now. And right now, the people in this country bearing the greatest burden of HIV, new HIV infections, are Black and Latino men in the South. And I'm here in Atlanta, so I'm very aware of this. And I think that the solutions will emerge the way they did throughout the AIDS epidemic, and that is that the community itself, and this was always a challenge, the tensions between white gay men and gay men of color. White gay men tended to say, hey, we founded these organizations, we have a lot of experience, let us show you how to do whatever it is. And of course, the Black guys, Latino guys, sort of pushed back against that. One of my favorite organizations that, folded, unfortunately, back in, I think, the late 90s or 2000 or so, was the Minority Task Force on AIDS, founded by Reggie Williams and Black and White Men Together, which is a social group for Black and white gay men who want to be together. And that organization was important because their approach was very affirming of Black and Latin culture and the aspects of the culture that could be used to help motivate and inspire guys to be safe, to take care of themselves, to take care of one another. And I always thought that was just a wonderful model for empowering a community to take care of itself rather than telling them how to do it. And so I think the solutions will be found in that same way. They will come from those people. They will say, here's what we need. Provide the resources to let us do what we know will be effective in our community. And I think it's kind of like Back to the Future. We learned these lessons, and so it's a matter of allowing and empowering other affected communities um, to take care of themselves, and they're the best judges of what they need.
Well, that's just great. And, it's kind of sanity and hope in a political climate where, Roe versus Wade has been repealed, and, draconian medieval approaches to women and reproductive rights and abortion, and, so it's I'm Arnie, who you knew, my life partner Arnie Kantrowitz, passed away. We were all friends. Arnie described me as a pessimist. He said, "Larry, you're a pessimist." It's true. I'm a pessimist. I try not to be, and it's people like you who help me actually, able to sort of glimpse past my defaults of pessimism. But it's a dark moment we're all kind of living through. Um, you know, just a quick aside. Did you know Dave Frechette? Dave was part of Black and White Men Together. He died from complications of AIDS years ago, many years ago.
No,
No, okay. I wondered if maybe he was one of the interviewees. Anyway, those are wonderful points. You have to. Another thing Arnie often said to me was, you have to let people be who they are, and we don't want to let fascist extremists just be who they are. But it speaks to your point of, you know, we're let us evolve as we are, feeling our way to doing in a natural kind of way, rather than trying to, force solutions or dictate models or, so I couldn't be more strongly in agreement with you on that. Um, so, I'm I'm pretty pessimistic about the future, but you do give me hope, John. You and your work on resilience and the wonderful work that you've done. And there's another book. Well, there's two other books. Well, the one that I was involved with you, supporting and following was the story of Wilhelmina the cow,
uh-huh.
that, who is like doesn't quite fit into the way cows are supposed to be in terms of who she hangs out with and where she what she wants to do or not do, and it's just a wonderful story, children's story. I just watched your interview with Dave Perry
Oh, uh-huh.
from, I don't remember what year that was from, but anyways, it's terrific. Anyway, and then you mentioned there was one other book that apparently I don't really know anything about. You have a book on disco.
Oh, right.
What is that?
Well, actually, yeah, I followed Victory Deferred with Hot Stuff, A Brief History of Disco in 2001. And, when I was asked at the time, why would you follow such a serious book, about AIDS and death and all these like sort of eternal, subjects with something so light and frivolous as disco? And my response, with the implication of you're sort of wasting your time on this kind of light subject. And well, first of all, I love music. I love to dance. I always have. And So it was a lot of fun to write that book. But one of the really key things that I discovered in writing the book was that, throughout history, when there have been difficult times, think about the 1920s and the Great Depression, music gets faster and dance styles get faster and sort of crazier. The Charleston, for example, in the 20s. Um, and so it's very clear that, music and dance provide a catharsis, an outlet to kind of blow off steam. And in the 1970s, we had Watergate and Vietnam and stagflation and just a whole lot of pessimism. And here you had this light, bubbly music that offered us the chance to put aside our worries and our problems and, just have a good time and remind us that life is for the living, and to live while we're alive. So I didn't see it as frivolous or a waste of time. I thought it was a lot of fun, to look back at that era, in my much younger years. Um, and yeah, I really enjoyed that. So
That's great. Somehow, maybe with my senior memory, because I'm very always very tuned into you and your work. I didn't remember that, but so that's wonderful. Um, so what about future writing?
well,
Your future writing?
Well, here in Atlanta, I have a day job. Uh, it's remote, still almost 100% remote. I'm the staff writer and magazine editor for Winship Cancer Institute of Emory University. So, still writing about kind of dark subjects, but um, I would be the first to point out that, Winship Cancer Institute is a place so teeming with life and life force and joy. And you have people with cancer and the doctors and nurses caring for them who are all committed to making life, as positive and worthwhile and healthy as possible. And so I find it extremely inspiring to be around such folks. Um, and so I have been thinking that I need to write another book. I feel like I have more free time than I've ever had. And I don't like having so much time on my hands. I'm not sure what the subject will be, uh, but we'll see.
I hope we will, because you've done wonderful work, and I'm sure whatever you do next will be along that continuum, something really to look forward to, and that will enrich us all. So I'm just noticing, Adrian, are you there?
Yes.
How are we doing in terms of sh- uh, are we're
I
approaching?
think well, I sent you some private messages, so I think it's good to
Oh,
have the
somehow I
Q&A.
didn't see that. Okay, sorry about that. You did tell me, you warned me in advance that there were gonna be those messages, and I didn't go. Sorry about that. Okay, so we're gonna go to some questions, John. Is that okay? Oh,
Yeah.
okay, now, uh, okay, give me a second. Have to get the chat. React. I'm looking for the chat. Oh, here. Okay, hold on. All right.
Yeah.
So I'm just, there may be some disorder in these questions, but I'm just going to go the ones in the order that I kind of see them here now at this moment. Okay. Here's one from Arthur Weiss. Do you guys think that Randy Schultz really believed that Gaetan Dugas was patient zero, or was it a way to conveniently find meaning, blame for a horrific situation? Do you want to go first? Or
Yeah. Well, and I also see Harold Kuden's next comment. Patient Zero was a fictitious character invented by Michael Denny, who was Randy Schultz's editor at St. Martin's Press. Uh, he told me this was necessary to give heft to the book. And I know that that has been the explanation for using Patient Zero as a fictional device to drive the narrative of And the Band Played On. And my response to that, and I feel even more uh, strongly about my take on this after reading Michael Lee's new biography of Randy Schultz called When the Band Played On, that apparently throughout his career, Randy Schultz had a very loose relationship with facts. He was a very good storyteller and a good writer, but I don't know about a journalist because journalists tend to traffic in facts. And my take is that Randy had very dramatic facts that he was working with, that he certainly had access to. And I feel that the use of Patient Zero was kind of a duck. It was ducking from, it seemed he didn't trust his own storytelling skills, that a good storyteller can weave together facts in a compelling and interesting narrative without having to use fictional devices to make it even more dramatic a story. So that's my take. I think it was kind of appalling, what he did to Gaetan Dugas, that there are people still to this day who believe that this Canadian flight attendant single-handedly spread HIV across the North American continent because of Randy Schultz. And I just think that it was really wrong.
well, I couldn't agree more. And actually, Michael Denny issued a public statement of apology about it and did acknowledge that they had basically, semi-fictionalized, um, the presentation of Dugas, and it was not really fact-based, and he did admit that honestly, which I think is pretty extraordinary. The But the other thing, it brings up the bigger issue of why, another reason why your book is so special. There are three great big books that have had a big impact, or three great works in our time. There's also Tony Kushner's Angels of America. But first was Randy Schultz's book, And the Band Played On. The second is Larry Kramer's The Normal Heart. And the third is David France's How to Survive a Plague. All of them are basically docudramatizations. There's a lot of factual material in there. And they, it's a lot of storytelling and narrative. You need, you have to, but I mean, they're not historical chronicles to the extent and degree that we still need. We still don't have a fully comprehensive, historical history of AIDS. Your book was the closest thing to that. Now it's, it covers a more limited range in time and so forth, but none of the other books. And Randy's book was really troubled by a lot of anger at the gay community for various reasons. We can't go into a whole thing. The book's written about this already, but the Patient Zero situation was a scandal that just got worse and worse the more we learned about it. And the best, thing you can say is that, Randy at some level believed this is giving Randy as much credit as you possibly can. Randy believed that this character was representative of a true type in the gay community of promiscuous, fast lane gay sex man who was traveling the world to events and, either, it was not best, and that it was representative of a serious problem that was ongoing, hence the title of his book, which happens to have been actually true. Promiscuity, which I used a word that I used to put in quotes, was a real problem. It remains a real problem in the gay community. We don't want to get derailed or sidetracked by all this. I think that these are genuine and enduring issues. However, I think superseding them is the affirmation, the things that you've talked about when finding our own way, harm reduction. These are surpassing principles, surpassingly important principles and values. But it doesn't mean that the other issues that were being highlighted didn't and don't exist. So thanks. So there are more questions. So let me so that, and then Hal Kuden, yes, we got patients here with fixed. Yes, okay. So I'm going to go further down now. There's more. Okay. This is from Michael Luciano. John, do you feel that the AIDS advocacy movement became in some ways a victim of its own success, given the revolution in HIV treatment and the advent of HAART in 1996? It seems, at least to me, that general LGBT advocacy then moved on, and the intense activism that developed around marriage equality, for instance, eclipsed the fight for continued focus on HIV/AIDS. The big LGBTQ plus organizations don't seem to put much time, effort, money into HIV at this point.
Yes, well, I am glad you asked that question, Michael, because I write about this very specifically and document it in Victory Deferred, the open access edition, which is the second edition, the 2011 edition. But I was writing about the de-gaying of AIDS. And it was a very deliberate strategy that was used by AIDS advocates in Washington to downplay the impact of HIV on gay men and to emphasize the impact on women and children. But if you look at the epidemiologic statistics throughout the epidemic, yes, there certainly have been many women and children affected by HIV, but in this country, in Western countries in particular, the epidemic has been by and large an epidemic affecting gay and bisexual men of all colors and ethnicities. Tim McFeely, one of the former directors of the Human Rights Campaign, back when it was called the Human Rights Campaign Fund, he put it very well, and I quote him in the book when he said, all we had to do is talk about the pain of the impact of AIDS. Why did we have to sort of downplay our own suffering in order to get money and resources rather than telling factual stories, about our hardship in dealing with this? And so, yes, I mean, Lori Jean, the former director of the Los Angeles LGBT Center, the last time I interviewed Lori out in LA, I mean, we talked about this, and because, as the director of this major LGBT center. She was very involved in the sort of national coalition of LGBT center directors. And she talked about how every time they have a meeting, HIV is never on the agenda. I mean, the last time I looked at the Human Rights Campaign website, the sparse bit of information about HIV was already several years out of date. And yet they claim that HIV is one of their concerns. They claim that, but the priorities and where they allocate their time and resources kind of belies that claim.
All of which kind of dovetails into this sort of trying to look to the future of where we're going and what we need to do differently and priorities and so forth. But there's a comment here from Krishna Stone. Krishna Stone is the legendary communications director of GMHC, who I've had the honor of being very close with for over 3 decades. And she's here and she says, I love disco classics music. When people ask me what my religion is, I reply, disco classics music. That's great. I got to remember that one.
That is great.
Thank you, Krishna. Now Hal Kuden has made a couple of more observations and comments about the LGBT movement, prior to AIDS, and that was there, and I guess it's implicit in what you're saying, that the AIDS movement began to evolve in tandem with what was already there, and Hal was one of the people, who was very notable from that period in those organizations, and we have to. I'm deeply immersed in Arnie's activism around Walt Whitman. And, if we don't do that work of documenting like the stuff that you're doing with the Institute and your project, and we don't mention all these people and acknowledge them, we will be just, written out of history. I mean, there is, look, the Tulsa massacre that happened, the race riots, I had never heard of them. And I thought, oh my God, how could I be so ignorant of such an incredibly horrible, important thing? And do you know that everybody I asked, including very politically connected, aware of it, none of them had ever heard of it. It had been completely expunged from history. They will do that with everything they can to us in the future going on, unless we fight back. So,
Well, yeah, and this is absolutely why I think it's essential that we claim our own history and celebrate our historic figures. Yeah.
so Adrian, what's happening? How are we doing?
Oh, I think we are doing great. So, are there any other questions that you would like to address at this point? I mean, there are some comments and questions in the chat, but it seems like you have answered them or most of them already, right?
I think so. My pointer keeps sticking. I'm not sure if, oh wait. Hold on. Yeah, I'm sorry. Can you see any further questions there? My cursor seems to get stuck on scrolling down. And so
Hi, it's Rachel here. I will jump in to say I cannot see any questions there, but that has been such an interesting discussion of the history and your experiences, and I really want to send a big thank you for sharing those with us and the group online. That's been super interesting, and we have ticked past the hour, which means a few people have dropped off, although this is being recorded, so hopefully we'll be able to share this for the folks who had to leave. But thank you again for joining us. Thank you for everyone in the audience who's come along and had questions. Adrian has just added a link in the chat to your book that is available online for anyone who has not had a chance to read it yet. I hope they get to have a read of it and learn the lessons and see the history that you've collected. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Thank you so much. And John, just a special thank you for a lifetime of outstanding, comparable service. Thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you. Thanks.
Well, thank you all for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
thanks so much. Thank you.